There we go. Oop. It is always such a loud thing when it says that. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. We're so excited to have the space today with everyone. My name is Jolene, and I'll do more of an introduction in a second. But we want to thank you all for joining us today as we have a conversation that I've been really looking forward to for a while. This idea of repairing or reclaiming, about how are we really talking and thinking about those intersections of sexual violence and sexual health within our Indigenous communities. And what are some of those things that are being done, can be done, should be done? And how are we really just kind of forming this like collective movement where we're able to talk about some really tough stuff in relationship with each other. And so we are here today kind of speaking as ourselves. We have an amazing new project called the National Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Center that is allowing us to have this conversation today. But I do want to name that the things that are going to be said are, our own individual opinions and our own individual thoughts that we're bringing into the space together. And so all right, so as I said, my name is Jolene. I am the coordinator of our National Tribal Sexual Assault Resource Center here at the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. I am a mother of a brand new 13-year-old, so exploring teenage life. I am White Earth Anishinaabe from Minnesota. I have my hearts in rural communities, but I'm living in the suburbs right now. I'm a licensed social worker. I am a runner. I am a sister, a daughter. I'm a lot of different kind of things that we're all bringing into space today. I am the granddaughter of a boarding school survivor. I am a runner, a reader, a theater lover. And I share these because I think that often in our work, especially those of us who do direct service with survivors, we often ask survivors to tell us a lot about themselves and a lot about their different parts of their identity. And we get to be professionals and we get to kind of hold those things back, right? For the sake of boundaries, for the sake of all these things. But it's also really exhausting in this work to kind of be holding back some parts of your identity. And so I share that as my introduction to you all today. I will turn it on over to my coworker and co-panelist for this discussion to introduce herself however she would like. And as she does that, I would also like to invite you all to chat in your own introduction, maybe with one of those parts of your identity that are kind of extra on the surface today. So, Ingrid?
Good morning, good afternoon. I am Ingrid Anderson. I'm the National Policy Director for the Minnesota Indian Women's Sexual Assault Coalition. It's an absolute honor to be a part of MIWSAC's fantastic team addressing issues of sexual violence from every possible angle. I am currently in Tulsa at the OVW Tribal Consultation, and I can tell you that there's just fantastic work going on, and also there's just a lot of amazing individuals who are doing that work. And so thank you, Jolene, for uplifting the importance of the individual as well as the work. I am of Standing Rock Lakota descent. I currently live in Western Nebraska, and my main focus of my professional career has been in direct service provision for victims and witnesses of crime. And most recently, I came out of a prosecutor's office doing that work. And so I'm excited to be able to step into policy work and a little bit out of direct service provision, even though that's where my heart is. My heart is also at home with my my baby girl, who I just did a little bit of shopping for from the vendors here at Tribal Consultation. And joining us here as well is Anna Goldtooth.
Puju, Anishinaabe, Duk, Makwa, Ganuakwe, Indigu, Anna Goldtooth, Indigenous Cause, Bemidjigamog, and Donjaba. Hi, everybody. My name is Anna Goldtooth. I am from Bemidji, Minnesota. My mom is from Red Lake, and my dad is Dene from Navajo Nation. And I have been working with Planned Parenthood North Central States doing comprehensive, culturally specific sex education in the Native community for going on 12 years. I don't know how that happened, but yeah, I'm going on 12 years of being a sexual health educator. Our work has really grown in that time. We've been able to add a couple full-time positions of other Indigenous folks who are doing work, culturally specific sex ed. Yeah, I use she and her pronouns. One of my most important roles is being an auntie. I have lots of babies that I'm pretty involved with. And I also like to do beadwork and porcupine quill work. And yeah, I actually just set up at my first art fair, which was really scary, but also exciting. And I'm like, oh, I really want to keep doing this. So that's that. I feel like that's all. I grew up in Bemidji. I'm from Bemidji. For those who don't know, Bemidji is like a border town, and the 3 largest reservations are in Minnesota are surrounding Bemidji. So, and then within Bemidji itself, there's quite a large Native population. So this is where I call home, and I'm just really happy and honored to be here.
Yes, and I'm so excited to have all these wonderful conversations with both of you today. But before we kind of dive in, I wanted to just take a minute and kind of get ourselves like centered into this space, which I know is hard for some folks because we are running our brains 82 million different ways. And it can just be hard to kind of sometimes have that transition. And maybe this is a little selfish, but like for myself, I sometimes need to mark those moments of transition, right? I have been busy all day. I've been back-to-back work travel, all these kind of things. And I'm feeling like a little and so feel free to make yourselves however you need to be in your space. Light, smudge, hold a rock, do anything that kind of makes you happy and makes you feel a little bit more present within our space today. We're going to be talking about some things that are going to be hard, which some of these things are going to be personal. We'll be sharing stories that are our own, those that have been shared with us for us to use, and those observations that we've made throughout this work. And before we get into that, I wanted to just kind of name that we're more than statistics. We're more than all the negative connotations that can often come with us working in, tribal communities or border communities. And we have so much like hope and joy mixed in with all of the things. And so I just wanted to just take a very quick minute to do a little bit of a grounding. And I want you to, however you are, whatever works for you, eyes closed, eyes open. I am not going to tell you how to be, but just take a moment and just stretch out and just kind of feel your body just getting as big and as wide as it can possibly be, and just opening up itself to this moment. I'd like you to take a moment to just hold on to your head, to just be thinking about all those things that we're going to be able to share, the wisdom that you hold, the wisdom that we have collectively to be able to make the change. Hold on to your face, to just, sometimes we aren't held enough, I guess, but to really be thinking about where are we able to be going? What is our voice able to do? Where will we go with this information that we'll be sharing today, that we'll be thinking about today? I'd like you to, give yourself a hug, which seems weird and seems silly, but sometimes to just wrap yourself up can be so much needed for so many of us in the midst of our busy, busy days. To take your hands and to just move down to your thighs and think about those muscles that move us, that carry us as we walk and do this work. all the way down. I can't touch my feet right now, but to your feet, to be thinking about where they will carry us, where our feet will go, those journeys that they've had before us and the journeys that we'll continue to have. I'd like you to kind of, as we kind of close this little like transition phase, I'd like you to just take a big deep breath and exhale and have it make a sound, which sounds weird. But one of my things recently has been thinking about how we often don't hear our own voices. We don't hear our sounds, or we keep our breath quiet when in fact, it's something that connects us, that it is life. Our breath is life. So just take a deep breath and exhale however you need to. All right, come back into space as you're able to, and we will just kind of get started on a really good conversation. And so I just want to name that, like, so Anna mentioned, that she's been working at Planned Parenthood for a little over 12 years. And part of the reason I have her on the call today is because that was the very beginning kind of my journey as well, and really thinking about how our sexual violence and sexual health intersected even, right? It was that like those first little sparks, because Anna was doing sexual health education and I was doing sexual violence advocacy. And we're recognizing the overlaps between our work. We met because of our work, but really we're realizing that there's some spaces where I was more welcome to talk about sexual violence and where she was more welcome to talk about the sexual health side of things. And with people realizing that we need to be interconnecting them so much. And so from those early conversations back when we were just brand new to even adult life, to now being able to have this conversation, and then to be able to bring in Ingrid, who has had such recent direct service work with survivors, as well as who at MIWSAC is holding this policy and this macro lens for us, and just bringing her full self in as well. I just wanted to kind of name that. So sexual violence, we're not going to do a full 101. There's plenty of spaces where we can learn about just those basics of sexual violence, but we did want to just name a few things kind of here in this space. And so we're going to be talking about all the kind of concepts of under sexual violence. We're not just talking about those things that, may be illegal, the sexual assault, the child sexual abuse, but we're also just talking as well about the culture that has kind of permeated, where violence with impunity is the norm for so many people in our lives, right? Sexual violence is a tool of colonization, and it can't be understated that it has been used since contact, right? Where there's these intersections with trafficking, which has once again also been happening since contact, but has really been gaining more and more prominence. And often to our relatives who have been trafficked, a lot of the times the sexual violence part of that hasn't really been as attuned to. And thinking about the harm that is done to the body, to the spirit, through the trafficking and through the violence that is being done against the body, right? I mentioned that, my grandma went to boarding school, and well, I honestly don't know and never will know truly what she experienced. What we all know is that in the boarding schools, it both impacted many of our, I was going to say young children, they were young children, but those are also our now elders, or are those who have been missing, were sexually abused within that space. It's also where they had to be learning, for those who weren't, or even those who were, that's where we learned about our bodies going through puberty, going through those first sexual experiences that may have been consensual. Also, it really impacted how we're able to raise our children, right? How you even felt within the relationships that you were going to be in, like after you left boarding school, right? And so thinking about how does that then trickle down to now? As well as all the intertwinings of religion, and that can be both, traditional cultural religions, as well as tools of colonization, and those who, led the boarding schools, including the Catholic Church, the Lutheran Church, and many, many others, and how religion also plays into our own feelings of self, our own views on sexuality, and how things kind of really work together. Anna, Ingrid, do you have anything else you want to add to that kind of section? All right, well, I'll just kind of keep going for a hot minute. And we also want to think about how our own bodies have been used within these spaces, how there's been violence against our bodies, which we don't always label as sexual violence. It's reproductive harm that has been done to us with forced sterilization. I will name once again, my grandma was forcibly sterilized. And they felt that, Native women should stop having children. And so they did that to her. And I don't even, once again, know the impact of that on her, but it happened to hundreds and hundreds of women, both through the IHSs and through other medical providers. And this is things that have been happening very recently as well. And so then thinking about if we don't even have control over when we can have babies, and who has that right for us, what does that really say? The loss of body autonomy, both within that, but also even within, our current, systems of, when we give birth, or even when we just go into the office or go into the doctor's office and they don't know things about us, or they feel that they know more about our own bodies than we do, right? And also this gynecological exams of children. And I've been hearing more and more about this from different communities all across the country, things that have been done to children, both in the past, on a widespread scale, within our tribal communities, as well as, what is currently happening today. And so I think that the more that we're able to really be talking about what has happened in the past can really, kind of give power and help people have voice within spaces. I said I have a 13-year-old, and how am I really helping to raise her to understand what are her rights? Even when she's seeing a doctor, when she's in these spaces where you're often supposed to, deign down to authority, but you're still meant to be able to, advocate for yourself. And also what's normal and what's not normal, because I'm talking to some of these people who, they went through these gynecological exams as children. They were being told that, oh, the school is bringing me, so therefore it's safe, right? It's not. 7, 8-year-olds don't often need internal exams, let alone on a yearly basis like that. But it was normal, and it was something that a community had just grown accustomed to. But we need to put a stop to these things, right? And so how are we better able to, really change communities and heal from the past harm that's done? So repairing that harm. As well as forced removal of children. And that's, both the 60s scoop in Canada, which I've been meeting more and more folks who are impacted by that, as well as within the US, as well as currently within our communities, with child protection and other sorts of systems, that should be repairing and help healing our families, but are still often being used as tools to tear them apart, right? And I know that there's much wonderful, wonderful work that is being done in communities, but it is something that is still the reality, as well as just the general disruption of our family structure. And how are we able to really, perform all those roles? We're not individuals. We are really as strong as those who are surrounding us, right? Those people who are both blood relatives and those who aren't. So that's just a little bit about this history of sexual violence. And so I kind of had as a kind of a broad question, but how within our communities do we learn about sexual violence? We are all grown women at this point, but looking back within our communities, within our families, how did we really learn about sexual violence? And this could not just personal stories, but thinking back, what have you learned from our work? What does that mean for the relationship between your body and yourself? I've been trying to thinking about that recently, is where are those first little teachings? And for me, thankfully, it wasn't from from sexual abuse, but thinking about the fact that even from a young age, I had that little the fear. I knew that there's certain people who I shouldn't be in space with, certain family members, certain neighbors who I avoided. And this idea that somehow innately within us as, 5, 6-year-olds, we have that. I've been just trying to think about how do we really talk about that more within our community. So Anna, Ingrid, anything you'd like to ramble about?
There's always so much I'd like to ramble about. I in thinking about bodily autonomy, I was at dinner last night with some amazing women who are here at Tribal Consultation, and we were just kind of sharing stories about, they were sharing stories about their children who are much older than my daughter. And, we're just kind of doing that thing that we do when we meet people, which is kind of placing each other in a relationship to ourselves, or placing ourselves in relationship to others. How do we know each other? What are those connections? And they were sharing some of their stories even about breastfeeding. And we know that one of the most powerful things to support mothers in breastfeeding is to see other women breastfeeding. And all of these women had stories about their own mothers sabotaging their breastfeeding relationship with their infants. And they were able to talk about that experience with such compassion for their mothers, to say, well, she survived the boarding schools, and so she never would have seen that. She never had those conversations with my grandmother, with her mother. And they talked, one woman gave a beautiful example of how she is still working to repair that connection with her mother, to talk about, that this isn't a sexual experience, this is nurturing my child. And I think about like the fetishization of the Indigenous female body, of the Indigenous body, like even to each other, we sometimes attach these these connotations to the body, or these connotations to our practices, the practices of Indigenous womanhood and motherhood, that are really just indicators of the colonizer, like that our thinking and our behaviors are still colonized in that way. And I want to share that story to encourage others who may be in direct service provision, that there is powerful healing work being done, and that you never know where a conversation is going to go. And I hope that today we can even, have some space to talk about what that healing looks like, what that intense work looks like as well, to repair the kinship systems, to reclaim our own bodies for our sake and for the sake of those yet to come.
Yeah, I really appreciate kind of going through this history and the context of why things are the way they are. And like what Jolene was talking about as sexual violence being a tool of colonization, and all the different ways that with colonization, people literally raped and pillaged their way through villages. And so that was one way that they could gain control over Indigenous people, and therefore disconnect them from their land connection. And so I just appreciate the history being explained this way, and that it's the very foundation of the United States. So I really appreciate this just being included in the conversation. When it comes to learning about sexual violence, I feel a lot of the things that Jolene said in a formal way. Actually, the first time that I ever learned about in a formal way was with Jolene. She had done a 40-week advocacy training for Native people, and it changed the way that I saw the world. Things made so much sense. I learned a lot about what sexual violence is. I learned about how it's reinforced through rape culture. And like, once you learn something, you can't unlearn it. And so for me, that was a pivotal moment where I'm like, oh, this changed the way that I saw the world. And we were able to, me and Jolene were actually able to, in the beginning of our careers, we did a beadwork circle, which was pretty simple in the logistics, but it had such a profound impact on community. What we would do is we would get together. We partnered. At the time, she was working with the sexual assault program in Bemidji, and I was working at Planned Parenthood, and we partnered to have these beadwork circles where we had conversations about the intersections of sexual violence and sexual health. And during that time, we would make things like earrings. And so people would be doing beadwork while we're having these conversations. And it was really cool. And people looked forward to coming. And it was sort of a safe way to have some pretty difficult conversations because you're doing something with your hands. And then there's also the sense of accomplishment by completing like a pair of earrings that you made within this like session. And so like when I think about healing in my work, when it comes to like, and this might come up in another question that we have, but like when it comes to sexual health education, as we're talking about holistic sexuality and that it's a part of our lives from beginning to end, womb to tomb, and that it's, you know, more than just sex, it's about, you know, understanding how the body works. It's about communication, it's about consent, it's about, you know, healthy relationships and menstrual products and testes and vulva. And so when we're having these conversations and we're trying to do them in like a sex positive way with the Native community, what we find out is for a lot of people, they start sort of realizing, and they know it deep down inside, but having the language to describe their experiences, when we're talking about consent, and statistically, I would say the majority of our participants have experienced some sort of sexual violence. And so when we're talking about what it means to have consensual relationships, a lot of people's feelings of trauma and shame come up because they've realized that a lot of their experiences have not been based on consent. And so for me, I see sex ed as an opportunity for people to get the tools and language that they need to describe their own experiences, as well as like get connected to services such as like the sexual violence centers. I kind of rambled, but that's kind of where my thoughts went.
Oh, and I just have so many thoughts kind of going with that. Yes. And I will say that it was forever ago, but that beading circle was still one of the more impactful like moments in my professional career. Just to be able to, the simplicity of just creating space. I think that sometimes when people are thinking about how do we have these conversations, we want it to be so big and so complicated, right? You know, we need all this research that has been, you know, empirically founded and all these sorts of things, which is great, right? But to be able to just truly be in space with people and recognize that simply by starting the conversation, by having that spark, or even just allowing for it to happen, like people, we know a lot of things just innately. And so being able to kind of like share and be in relationship just taught me a lot. Also, Anna was a better beater than I was, just naming that. And so we're thinking about all these different sorts of things. And I don't know, just trying to build out this idea that I think that when we talk about the sexual part of sexual violence, it scares people. It scares advocates across the country, right? You know, I can have people who can talk about domestic violence and sexual violence and impacts of trauma like all day long. But the second that you start to talk about this idea that, you know, like our bodies are maybe innately like sexual in an intimate sort of way, it starts to scare them. So many advocates and, you know, law enforcement prosecutors, even people like who are part of like the peripheral systems that intersect with survivors, you know, they can't say the word vulva, right? You know, I think like, I mean, I very much remember like the law enforcement who were just, you know, new to the job, feeling very nervous about just, you know, even like naming certain things that, you know, a survivor had said. And so if the people who are doing this work on a day-to-day basis can't use simple terminology without like feeling a level of shame, like what is that really saying to survivors, right? You know, how are we creating spaces that are honestly welcoming for them after a very difficult experience, right? You know? And so, Ingrid, anything else pop into your head? You look like you're thinking, and I'm just like.
I'm thinking about this great question or comment we have in the Q&A box about consent being difficult to grasp without an understanding of coercion. And I'm just going to put this out there, I was typing a response, but maybe other folks would have some insight as well about what has helped you to understand coercion, coercive control, and how to apply that to our understanding, teaching, and modeling of consent, both maybe as advocates and just as humans. If anybody has any insight, feel free to type it or contribute however you'd like.
And I'd mentioned in the chat, but somehow the chat was not really very well enabled for this call. And so if there are thoughts that you have, please type it into that Q&A and we'll be reading things and helping kind of continue on this conversation. Honestly, this is one of those areas where it is hard. Like it is when so many people don't understand what consent means even within a relationship, right? Growing up, it was often, like the joke was, no means try harder, all those sorts of ideas. And so often, when we're doing this work, people will talk about power and control wheel, and people will talk about how it's always, somebody wanting to exert control and power over somebody else, which I do think has a lot of validity, especially when we're talking about the roots of colonization and the intersections with rape as a tool of war and all these sorts of things. At the same point, that sometimes weirdly feels controversial saying it, but sometimes I feel that some of it comes down to the fact that we aren't talking with anybody about what sexuality should and can look like, and how to really have these conversations with potential partners. And not saying that sexual violence is a misunderstanding in any sort of way, but what could our sexual relationships look like if we had better conversations about consent? And there've been many different, campaigns out there over the years, yes means yes, and all these sorts of things. But this level, that idea of like, what is coercion still kind of comes into play, right? And how I have, people in my own life who they've been married and they still feel this obligation to, say yes to their husband, right? Naming the fact that marital rape in Minnesota, at least, was not made illegal until 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And in some states and maybe even some tribal codes may not still have it written in. But it's this idea of like, I just have to say yes, or it's acquiescing as opposed to actually wanting something. And for some, it's because it's easier than saying no. For some, the security of whatever relationship, even if it's a momentary, even if it's a night relationship, right? Like, it still is safer to them than other things they've experienced, right? And so, I don't know, just so this idea of how do we have these conversations, and how do we also pick up indicators and cues for ourselves about when something is wanted versus unwanted? Anna, any thoughts on coercion? I don't know how to phrase that without sounding strange, but.
No, I just sort of had a thought about just like how important it is. Like, okay, so when we're doing our sex ed groups, we also do peer education programming. So we will train youth and adults. We actually have adult programming to become the lay health advisors or peer educators. But it just also, like hearing Jolene speak, I'm like, it's so important that one of the things that we try to do in our groups is bring in people from the sexual violence centers or domestic violence shelters to come in and present to our group. And like, that is one way I feel like we can, I guess, partner and sort of bridge some of that, because like, if we're bringing in someone from a sexual violence center and they're explaining like what consent is, and they're explaining what services they have, our participants can feel more empowered to refer people to those services, as well as like seek those services themselves when we actually have someone like come in and be like, hey, this is what we do. We're here, we're 24/7, this is what we do. And so, yeah, that's it.
And I'll just add one quick thing, Ingrid, is just this idea of, like having a true face, and when it's actually just like relative to relative, human to human sort of stuff, like it's so much easier for people. And I think that that's why I don't know, the more that we can be partnering with people, and you may not have, you know, a sexual health educator in your community, but thinking about who else might be there, right? You know, is it somebody who's in nursing? Is it somebody who's is a traditional healer? Is it just somebody who has an interest and is able to really kind of help bridge that gap, right? So, Ingrid?
I just wanted to touch on two things. When we present data, of course, we understand that this is just the data that's been compiled, and the anecdotal evidence and data is just as powerful. And I know, coming from a non-native prosecutor's office, that there can be almost this temptation to minimize the prevalence of certain acts of violence, particularly against bodies of color, because the data doesn't necessarily show it. And I just want to encourage everybody to just believe the person in front of you, and maybe just to understand the context of data, and the fact that we're still working towards data sovereignty. And the other thing is, I had a really, there's a very interesting comment made by the Attorney General of the Muskogee Creek Nation, who was just presenting testimony. And she made the comment about, you know, that our tribal laws maybe don't often reflect our healing, and that we need to update our codes, update our laws to reflect that we do not accept violence, and that we, you know, that the penalties that are available also reflect our understanding of the gravity, you know, the intergenerational even effects of violence. And she referred to this comment that I'm sure we've all heard, which I wish it wasn't so, but you know, that violence or coercion in a relationship, maybe even just not just maybe spiritual or psychological, emotional violence, in addition to or alone, separate from physical violence, is Indian love. And I've heard that most of my life, whether a joke or serious, that is a narrative that exists. And really what I think we need to talk about when we hear statements like that, or when we confront attitudes like that in ourselves and our families, even in our work, is to recognize that there is healing that needs to be done, and that we don't have to accept that this has been passed down, that this has been behavior that's been accepted, that there is an opportunity for change there. And I think, I hope that today we all leave this webinar empowered to confront those attitudes, and lead people as we ourselves are healing, towards healing themselves.
And it's hard. I just want to name that, though. That's the thing, though. Like, I love to talk about this because sometimes it just feels, it's what excites me, right? It's something where I think that with so much harm that has been done, we have to be able to be thinking about that there is, like, what could the future be if we were in true relationships with ourselves, right? If we were respecting everybody else's body sovereignty, and our body sovereignty was being respected, and all these things. And I also know that it's kind of naive of me to just be like, we can do this. When, you know, I've been in, part of my role is, you know, visiting communities and just kind of like working with them as they kind of think about their sexual violence response. And I've been in so many communities recently where they're just talking about how prevalent, you know, yes, the sexual violence, but also just a culture of harmful sexual thoughts, I guess, where it's the norm for everyone in that community to, you know, post like very like sexually charged, like Facebook things, like that are jokes that are talking about sexual violence against each other, you know, and it's just kind of this like community where it's like, oh, it's just, this is just how we talk to each other, which is, you know, how the grandpas talk to the sons, how they talk to their grandsons, and then how our women folk are also, you know, engaged in it as well, or have to kind of deal with it as just their day-to-day sort of life, right? Even if they don't agree with it, but it's to the point where when it's happening to you every single day, they can't get upset all the time, right? And which is not the way that we should be behaving. And so we're thinking about how for some for some communities, like we're going to have to be like taking a pause almost and thinking about how are we from the bare minimum being in a relationship with each other, and how are we talking with each other? What are we sharing on Facebook, and how should you not share that sometimes? But yeah, so wanted to put in the slide about healthy sexuality as this, oh, the chat should be enabled now. That is wonderful. As resilience. And so we just want to talk about how, if we're really able to reclaim that relationship with ourselves. So we're thinking, so we talked a little bit about, like the history of sexual violence. There was a slide up for a little bit about some of the stats, which are hard because they're both reflective. They provide some naming and some voice to things, but we also know that it doesn't always truly tell the full story about what is happening in our communities, and nor what that true impact is on folks, right? And so after sexual violence, we're thinking about, both the immediate harm, the physical harm that can be caused to somebody, but we're also talking about how across the lifespan, it impacts people's ability to trust. It can have lifelong physical impact, both, on your reproductive system, as well as what stress and trauma can do to your body, which can put you at increased risk of so many different diseases and so many different things across your lifespan. As well as, how are you really connected to yourself, like spiritually even, and how, say if your sexual violence was done by a spiritual healer, like how does that really help, or how does that really impact you as you're moving things forward within your life? How does that impact you when, you have kids yourself? How does that impact you when your kids are the same age you were when you were sexually assaulted? How does that impact you as you're transitioning into, I'm just speaking for myself, like as I'm 36, maybe in 20 years or so, I may become a grandma. That's a weird thought. Never mind. We're not going to my own existential crisis right now. But really thinking about like, what are those different roles and how are there different touch points in our life that should be celebrated? But often when we have this trauma with us, it can really cause a lot of things to kind of spark or to hold back, and to like, there's so many places where I go in community and people are like, I would never let my child have a sleepover, for example, which I'm not saying that that's a bad thing to do, but when we're thinking about the fact that I'm like, oh, like everything that we do is sometimes clouded by a fear of what can be done to our children because of the harm that is often done in spaces, right? I'm like, what would it be like if we could just, not have that constant fear and just really be able to like trust and have kids not have to be, like shielded from violence from the very beginning, right? How we just had communities where that wasn't what the norm was. And so we really want to like reclaim that relationship. And even like for folks who are doing this work, it's hard. We had a staff retreat last year, and I went up to take a nap and I came back down and they were doing a talking circle, okay? And the talking circle stick they were using was a dildo, a phallic shaped sex toy. And it was interesting. So we'd had a guest speaker who was kind of helping to lead us through it. It was Theta Newbreast, who's with Native Wellness Institute. And it was really interesting because of, even for those of us like doing this work, we're at a national and a coalition level. It was really hard for people to be thinking about like, what is your relationship with even an object like that, right? And how it threw some people through kind of like a psychological loop. Other people couldn't stop laughing. Other people were just chill and trying to ignore it. But all those reactions are normal. And I'm not saying people should be doing this as an exercise necessarily, right? But like, what does it mean when people who are doing this work are still coupling so many different things when it comes to like male genitalia, right? So but yeah, thinking about how these things impact us within all of our relationships. What are the different like medicines and healing practices that we have within our community? And so many communities have them, right? Thinking of, what we have access to here, include, like the jingle dress, dancing, the cedar baths, all these other sorts of ways of kind of providing healing. Can we also talk about that importance of even like So ceremony around, which Anna could maybe talk even more about, but ceremonies around, like first moon or those other transitions in life, as well as even naming ceremonies, and how for so many folks who are unnamed, it can feel like you are kind of lost. And especially for folks who may have, started engaging in behaviors after due to their trauma, they might not have ever really been named, right? And so how is that one way of kind of helping to repair and rebuild folks?
I really love this topic. It's very exciting to me. One of the things that I think it's important to keep in mind is that with the creation of the United States and all of the policies that were meant to remove us from our connection to the land, that also, eroded our own tribal sovereignty and our own say in what happens in our communities. And so the more that we can reclaim some of our original instructions, is how my mom describes it, our original instructions, I feel like that's kind of where, and that's kind of key, I guess, to our healing. And I feel like all the things that you've said, Jolene, are so real, where it's like people have experienced trauma with spiritual leaders, some people might feel like they're not worthy of accessing these ceremonies, or that they have to be at this certain place in their life to be able to attend. And that's just not the case. Therefore, people who want to connect and want to get that healing, and that should be made available to everybody. One of the things I think, the space that we created with the beadwork circles, or even just the space that we do with our sexual health education, one of the things that I feel like comes out of that is that people feel more comfortable talking about their body. They feel more comfortable even just realizing that they may have experienced trauma. And I think one of the powerful things is that you're not alone in that. And you feel, unless you're making those deliberate, intentional connections, you might feel like you're the only person that experienced that. And it can be very isolating. And so that the key to our healing is also connecting with ourselves and connecting with one another. And we've had ceremonies that have actually helped facilitate that process in kind of a more natural way. But it's also important to remember that those were outlawed until 1978. They were also disrupted through boarding schools, which we talked about earlier, because people were, kids were literally still babies, 5 years old, leaving their home, leaving their comfort and loving parenting to go to these schools. And so for the survivors that did live, because we found out, as we're finding out more and more, there's all these graves, and there's a lot of people that did not survive. And so the people who did survive are, returned home, but they didn't have those teachings that they would normally have. And so and they're also carrying all this shame and trauma and guilt, and feeling the sort of brainwashing that happened, the psychological and spiritual abuse that happened at boarding schools, where they were taught that being Indian is not a good thing. And so you're returning home to these communities with that disruption. And so I feel also just giving our own families grace. I feel everyone's sort of done their best, and each generation it gets a little bit better and easier. And for this generation, we're kind of picking up the pieces a little bit more, making the connections, wanting more for our children. And that's what comes up too in our conversations when we're doing sex ed, because one of the components that we do is we work with adults. And one of the things that we do is we help train on how to be an askable or approachable adult, and how to have conversations about consent and about puberty with their young folks. Because Often what comes up is they'll say that they never had any sort of education. They've never had somebody talk to them about their body. And we know that a lot of that comes from that shame from sexual violence. And so it's very deep. But like that intergenerational trauma is like very real, and we see it in the way that maybe people are really uncomfortable talking about these things, when back in the day they used to be a normal part of our conversation. So I always give the example that there's a word for vulva in the Ojibwe language, and that just excites me because I'm like, oh, we talked about our bodies, not only that, but like Jolene had mentioned, there's different rites of passage ceremonies, coming of age ceremonies. We did certain things to celebrate a person's like development. And for example, like these rites of passage or these coming of age ceremonies are being revitalized right now. And I just attended one in Standing Rock about a month ago. And there are these young folks that are going through puberty. And what they did was they camped out for 4 days. They went into sweat. The coordinators had different speakers come in. So me and my coworker actually traveled out there to speak about like the puberty part and menstrual products. But they get all these different teachings from different people. And one of the most like exciting parts about those ceremonies, is that it brings people together. So all of these young people are going through this thing together, but their families, they also have like a sponsor. So they had someone who sponsors them and who kind of helps them through the ceremony. But what happened is like their families ended up camping out kind of like with them, kind of outside of their circle, but still with them. And so like there was connections happening outside of this like group of young people. It was all of their adults who were also making connections. And afterwards, an elder came up to me and she thanked me for our presentation on puberty and anatomy, menstrual products. And she was like, I've never received this education. And when I first had my period, I had no idea what was happening. I was scared. I thought I was dying. And so like for the reclaiming and revitalizing of those ceremonies is like super important, because it's like that's where a lot of people are getting some of that education and feeling connection with each other and one another. And I think that's really exciting. And the other thing that I thought of is like my sisters had done one for my niece, and they didn't have any elders in their community who knew how to do those ceremonies. And but they wanted to do something. They wanted to make that puberty stage as much of a positive thing as possible, because it gets a very, very hard, very awkward stage. And so my sisters, they kind of had to work through, I guess, some of the insecurities of not really knowing how to do these ceremonies, and they put something together for my niece anyway. And so kind of like, I don't know, a part of reclaiming is also like, I guess trusting yourself and trusting your own like kind of personal guidance and spiritual guidance. And what they did was something actually pretty similar to what they did in Standing Rock. So my niece camped out in a teepee all weekend, and all weekend long, she had people bringing in gifts. She had people bringing in different teachings. She had uncles there just showing her love. And it was like this community thing that provided healing. It's like a ripple effect, because yes, it's about this young person, but like, but then also this other healing is happening because it's bringing people together to support this young person. And the coolest thing about this was like, so she got a bunch of gifts, and I actually did a puberty lesson there too with my nieces and nephews. I was like in the teepee with like my like flip chart of like the vulva and the penis and stuff like that. And so like I got to do that part of it. And but what happened was like one of the younger girls who hadn't yet started her time was like, I can't wait until my ceremony. And it was just the sweetest thing, because it was like some, you know, we're making this a positive, reclaiming thing, and people it's now something that people can look forward to, where she was like, you know, instead of being something that was fearful or dirty or bad, it was actually like a positive thing.
I'm just very happy right now after listening to you. I feel like content, like a hug somehow. No, I thank you so much for sharing all that. And yeah, and just thinking about like, I remember being very confused. So my first two, actually one of my first like thought, like when I was learning about periods, I was very confused like when I got mine, because I remember reading in an old copy of like, "Are you there, God? It's me, Margaret." And they're talking about like menstrual belts. And I'm like, what is this? You know, and recognizing them like, oh, if I'm only learning things from books and not having conversations with people, it's going to maybe be outdated or misinformation that I'm really receiving. Right. And so thinking about the more that we're able to have these conversations, because it's not just about the individual, right? Like it's not just within your family structure. It's really collectively, how are we able to create healthier communities who just know more even about our own bodies and about other people's bodies, right? And because all of our bodies are different, and is also adding another ripple or another layer when folks are two-spirit or non-binary or all these other different ways that your body presents and is, right? And so just trying to always be thinking about like, people have all these different layers, and how are we really kind of I know, paying attention to that and talking about that within these spaces too, right? I'm gonna, by the way, these slides are just kind of like here, just as like background for us. And we've already talked a little bit about this idea of body sovereignty, but I was wondering, I had this asked one time and I struggled with my answer even after doing this work, but I struggled with a very concise definition of what body sovereignty is. Do either of you have one? It's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, and like we understand the concept, but what is the elevator speech of what body sovereignty is? Fascinating.
Yes. Oh, I guess for me, and like I'd have to definitely like Google some stuff, but for me it's connected to or similar to like body autonomy, having a say over what happens to your body. And in this sense, I also feel like sexual health education, especially at a young age, you know, because like there's age / developmentally appropriate conversation. So like what you would talk to a 15-year-old would look different than what you're talking to like a 5-year-old. But one of the things that we do encourage people to teach is that concept of bodily autonomy and consent, and that you have a say over what happens to your body. And in my mind, I feel like that is sexual violence prevention, because when people are feeling empowered, when they know the correct terminology for their body parts, when they know that they have a right to say who gets to touch them, when they're taught those things at a very young age, they're more likely to come forward when that consent is violated. And so I really feel strongly that sex education at a young age can be prevention. But that's kind of what I think of when I hear body sovereignty, is the body autonomy part. Yeah.
I just like that both of you paused as well, because when I was first asked, I'm just like, I know what this is. Like, it's something that's almost, when things are so innate, I guess, like it's hard for me to verbalize. And this is also just naming the fact that even for those of us who are doing this work, it's not always something where we have that. We're not perfect with our answers, and we're not meant to be perfect as we're doing this work. We're going to mess up. You're going to say things that maybe even seem maybe offensive, or maybe you just haven't learned enough. Maybe the information that you're going off of is also something that, you know, maybe the words have changed around certain things, right? You know, But as Anna was talking about, with the ceremonies, like sometimes we need to trust and we need to try, right? And we need to have spaciousness for all of us to be able to kind of be doing this work together. And so we do want to be thinking about like, what is that connection? Like, how are we truly sovereign beings, right? Just as we have sovereign nations, how are we that ability to I don't know, to have true, not ownership, because it seems weird because I don't even feel like I own my own body sometimes, right? But this idea that we have that right, and with that level of autonomy that we have to be talking about that. And that's also the same, once again, for our children. Also, we often don't talk about how our elders often lose their sense of autonomy at different points, where their own bodies get taken, not from them, but where when people are having to clean you and things like that, what does it really mean? And how are we still supporting folks in those different stages of life as well? So.
And I will say we've just had a very productive day because we were having a conversation here about our elders who perhaps are experiencing some form of dementia or just needing a higher level of care, and what our resources for assisted living or nursing homes, that kind of thing, really look like. And some of the feedback was that our elders who are receiving like non-traditional care or care by like non-native folks or people who perhaps aren't educated or aware are having perhaps like flashbacks or similar responses, trauma responses as they did to the boarding school. And a story was shared about an individual who actually believed that he was back at the boarding school that he survived because of the way that he was being treated by his medical care professionals. And so when I think about body sovereignty, I do think about our relationship with the land. Our resilience comes from creation, and it comes from our medicines. And we've already talked about those practices being healing, like to reclaim them if we've lost our connection to them, and also just as continual resilience. And I don't I do hesitate at the word ownership, Jolene, like you as well, but I think that a lot of it is an understanding, like a vibrant, dynamic connection to ourselves, like not being dismayed that all of a sudden, we hear, oh, I turned 40 and, my whole body changed, or I never had cellulite before, and now all of a sudden I have it. All of these maybe like trivial conversations, but that represent a dynamic relationship with our physical presentation of the self, and understanding that the land is vibrant and dynamic and changing as well, but that there's like a symbiotic, nurturing relationship, and that connection can be as vibrant as we allow it to be, and can forge resilience as much as we invest ourselves in it. And so from more of like a policy standpoint, I do feel like that is an important concept to examine, because it forces us really to declare our values. Like, do we value the physical presentation of youth, or do we value the physical presentation of the evolving body, and what that looks like at every different stage of life, that it's equally valuable and it's equally healthy, and that relationship should evolve. And how do we model that for our children? I think I love what we've heard about language here, like the way that we can speak openly about our bodies and speak positively, and acknowledging the ups and downs without losing that connection. I think that's that connection point is where our resilience and where our power and sovereignty really stands.
Yeah, and I'll read there's a comment in the chat that says, having agency of our bodies as we navigate decision-making while existing in highly social politicized spaces, free from coercion, control, and violence. And I really like that. Thank you. And I also just want to name that, so we're talking about bodies, and as I mentioned, all of our bodies are different, but so we also are thinking about, both as we age, but, for folks who I was at a presentation recently and I was, told that people with disabilities can't ever give consent. And it was really interesting for me because I'm like, that is a very broad statement that I just heard, right? And that is something that's not always true, because when we're thinking about how many folks in our communities have, so many varying ways of being, how can we say wholeheartedly that, no one is able to, anyone with a disability isn't able to give consent? And so we're thinking about how have we also, infantilized, folks who have disabilities, and how are we able to really recognize that many folks are able to give full control. Like, I mean, even people who, like, I don't know, sorry, my words just got kind of fumbled right there, but really just thinking about how are we viewing different people as whole. And I feel that that's something that has been lost. I've even heard, folks being like, oh, no one over the age of 60 has sex. And I'm just like, oh, so we're just like really like limiting who we see as, sexually viable people. And also that does away with that idea of, sexual violence isn't necessarily about sex, right? And it's not about some form of beauty. It's not some form of anything else, but really recognizing that we all, I know that all of us have different relationships kind of with ourselves and with our bodies and with each other. And so that was just a little not very eloquent side note. But kind of
it was eloquent. But can I actually speak to this comment from Afton? I just want to thank you for your comment. And it reminds me of one thing that I feel like should be mentioned is like reproductive justice, the framework of reproductive justice and how it centers like the whole person. And so I'll just give the very brief, quick, basic definition of reproductive justice that was defined by Sister Song. But what it is the right to have children. The reason why that has to be explicitly said is because for a lot of people that right was taken away. So that is something that has to be said, the right to have children. Also the right to not have children, which gets at the point of having education about the body, understanding how pregnancy happens, understanding the different methods of contraceptives that are out there, understanding how to make appointments and to advocate for yourself at doctor's appointments. As well as like the access to abortion. And then the third part of the definition is the right to parent the children we have in safe and healthy environments. And that one is kind of like the real kicker, because it's like all these other socio economic and types of other things can affect a person's overall well-being. And so I really like working from that reproductive justice framework, because I feel like it centers the whole person, and it also goes beyond rights. And so, for example, somebody might have the legal right to an abortion, but can they access that abortion? And so it goes beyond reproductive rights and legal rights to really at this idea of like justice, and what does that really look like when people are fully empowered and have the economic and the safety to make decisions about their body. And so I kind of, I like using that framework, and I just appreciate your comment, because it is like we're talking bodily autonomy, and there's all these things that are happening, and the overturn of Roe v. Wade, and but there was even communities before that that were almost operating from that because of just the distance between that they would have to travel to get services. And so just all of that. I'm glad that you named it, because it is the society that we're living in right now, and like what can we do, what kind of control and power do we have,
Thank you for that. I think it's an incredibly important part to all this conversation, and that kind of like underpins a lot of it, right? And so kind of with our last like little bit here, I mean, I think it's kind of been embedded throughout, but really kind of thinking about, so we try to lay the framework a little bit about, like what is sexual violence, and thinking about those intersections, right, between sexual violence and sexual health, and how that really, like looks within our communities, but also I'm really thinking about, okay, so we have this, like, what are some of those other ideas, for change, particularly within like our own spheres of influence, as well as those relationships that we have with others, right? And so once again, if this was an easy thing to do, our world would be much healthier, right? But at its very least, we can take these steps. And if we all are doing this collectively, if we're all saying that this is a priority for us, for our families, for our communities, for our tribes, for the bigger area that surrounds us, like, we can make a lot of change, and that change will have these ripples. If we're talking about the huge impact that the boarding schools had on our communities, on our families, we can also think about, like, okay, so what if we're that first step to kind of create that change? If you're that first if you're the first person in your family who stops drinking, what is that ripple that can kind of spread throughout that, and how does that then lead to generations of future people, for example, right? But what are some of these opportunities for change kind of related to some of this? This is an opportunity for Ingrid to ramble for a second.
So I actually really enjoyed kind of compiling this list, because those moments where we think, or maybe have a realization like, oh, this is the time when I can pivot this conversation, or this is the moment when I can introduce different language to, my intimate relationship, my family of origin, my coworkers, etc. And I would just like all of us to consider these moments so that we are prepared to be an agent of change. I don't think we need to go through all of these individually, but I'm just loving the resurgence of Indigenous birth work and the midwifery resurgence and traditional practices that are being revitalized and passed down within different nations and of course across tribal identities. One opportunity for change that I think we can all take advantage of, but probably before the day is over, is language. And so I'm glad for what we've already talked about so far today about language. Significant portion of my direct service provision was in child advocacy centers. And one thought that has really informed my work and my journey into motherhood was this idea that if you don't teach your children, somebody else is going to. And so if we are not modeling language, as Anna talked about, anatomically appropriate language in whatever language, whether that whether that's English or our language of origin or whichever language, that there are predators who groom, whether we're talking about the media, whether we're talking about an individual predator, who want to separate us from our understanding of our body, who want to separate us from our sovereign body. And that language is a tool to do that. Language was a tool of colonization, and language is a tool that is being used to continue that work today. So if we don't say the word vulva, if we're not talking about like a penetrative sex act, those kinds of words, we really are separate from our sexuality, from the body. And in my years working in a prosecutor's office, interfacing with law enforcement, sun up to sundown, usually getting calls in the middle of the night, I can say that I have had one attorney and one police officer who could comfortably say the word vagina and understand the difference between the vulva and the vaginal canal. And that is that's just a small example in a small community of what happens when we're ignorant, that we can't even understand what's happening to our own bodies. We can't understand what's happening to the bodies of our friends, our sisters, our family members, our community members, whether it's consensual or not. And then where do we go from there? If it's a criminal act, or if, it's the development of an intimate relationship, or if it's leading to a pregnancy, or if we're teaching our children about preventative health care, those sorts of things. I think that language is a baseline starting point that we all can start working on and addressing, even in just our daily living and our relationship with ourselves. I also do appreciate the discussion about your beadwork together, because I put that on here as those traditional practices. I love that picture of like a non-intimidating conversation. Like, we can talk about just about anything if our hands are busy and we don't have to make direct eye contact. And so if other people have ideas of those traditional practices or ceremonies that you'd like to talk about, feel free to drop those in the chat as well.
Yeah, I have a little to add to this too. I feel like opportunity for change can also start with like yourself, and being clear in your own intentions and your own identities, and embracing those identities, because that could lead us to like meaningful connections with other people, and that could really be like an agent of change. And like, we're in this constant change, like things happen all the time. Language changes to be, more inclusive, more humane. Approaches change all the time. Like, I remember at the beginning of my career, our approach to abortion access was like way different than it is now. And so like people's approaches change. And so like, I feel like the change part is constant. And the more that we embrace kind of the complexities and name it and connect with one another, like just the stronger that we could be. And also understanding the intersections of all these different movements, because they are related. You can't talk about reproductive healthcare without addressing racism, because there was racism within the medical field. You can't talk about abortion access without talking about economic justice. And so like, there's all of these intersections. And the more that we sort of understand our complexities, understand our own self, I feel like, I just feel like the stronger we'll be having conversations like this. Like, and in a way, like, even those informal conversations where you're like really just kind of connecting with one another, I think could be really powerful.
I agree. And I think that sometimes, honestly, like, even as a small step within our own work, like having some of these small conversations when you're at a conference, like over coffee, like it's weird, but I've started to like be like, I'm 36 right now. And I'm like, okay, so like menopause is a ways off, hopefully, but like, it's still a thing that I've been intrigued about. Like, what does that mean for the body? What does that mean for my role within society, right? And within community. And so I kind of just started to talk with people about menopause over coffee at a conference, because I can't do small talk, apparently. I just have to dive deep right away. But even those sorts of conversations, to be able to normalize them. I also really want to think about how, even within our organizational policies and procedures and the way that we act, like both with our coworkers and with the people who we serve, or who, you might refer to as your clients or patients, how are there, what do we have in writing? What is codified that will either promote and name people's right to autonomy, and that this whole conversation and all of these related things are uplifted, or how on the flip side have we done some things that we might want to reconsider, and some of this may even be like, if you're like a dual or multi-service agency, what sort of checks do you do when people, when they come into shelter, for example, right? And I know this is getting more into the domestic violence lens of things, but I think it's just very important. So are you searching somebody's body? I've heard about people doing pat downs at shelters before. How much of the people's bags are you really searching, and what are you searching for? Also, how do you react when you see certain things within people's bags? Just going to name like some of these sorts of things. So just really thinking about like, how are we training people on both how to be accepting and really thinking about, like, when we say autonomy, what do we really mean? And I find it to be so easy to talk about this in theory, but then once you start to get into some of like the down and dirty, like practical sides of it, people want to make excuses, or and sometimes they're valid, right? But at the same point, like, we often make excuses for, like, it's easier this way, or we have to think about this, or we have to think about that. And so it's like, okay, so how can we say that we value body sovereignty when we are, you know, forcing people to go through pat downs all the time, or like, or when we aren't respecting their right to choose their own menstrual products, which I've seen in some places. Like, you get like one option that you're meant to have, and that's all that you can do, or just so many different things. Like, so if we can really start to parse out each of our like policies and the way that we behave, what can we do to make things more equitable, more driven by body sovereignty principles, and driven by like our collective Indigenous wisdom, right? And so if we're able to like think about that, even our interdisciplinary policies, like, where are those components when we're doing sexual, you know, if you're doing medical forensic exams at the hospital, how are we really talking about what consent really looks like in those spaces? And then if you're adding that layer of children, like, how are we really talking about what that looks like? And so, yeah, I think there's so many opportunities for change. I also think there's so much beautiful work that is already being done in so many communities. So we are starting to kind of come to a close, but I just wanted to give the opportunity to Ingrid and Anna to, if they have any final like thoughts they want to get out there. And so just take a breath. And Ingrid, anything you'd like to share as you're passing your something that you're mulling on or anything?
I'm just always in awe of the resilience of our communities, and I hope that we leave our time together feeling very hopeful. Of course, here at Tribal Consultation, we're considering the historical impact of what we've survived and how we ended up, you know, in our sovereign to sovereign relationship with the federal government and those sorts of things. And I think sometimes as we can feel like we're healing when we've simply stopped talking about what we've survived. And when we feel like, okay, we've changed our written policies, we no longer use those words. We've, you know, embraced time off for our staff for ceremony for themselves and their children. But I appreciate Anna's call to just be very connected to ourselves and to be very, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Anna, but to be very authentic and connected to what our feelings really are, and to be open to what comes up through the healing process. These intersections of healthy sexuality and sexual violence is, it's no small thing. And whether it's been our personal experience or it's the experience of those around us, or our mothers or grandmothers, we know that that those effects linger, but so do the effects of people who are willing to work on healing and to talk about that. And so just encourage folks to consider the work, but also to consider the value of the self and what that ongoing work to stay connected, to reconnect to the self is. And I hope you know that MIWSAC is available for any kind of, I should say, technical assistance, but also just to be a person, to be people who are in the thick of it, and certainly would love to talk about these issues, the evolving picture of sexuality in Indigenous communities, for Indigenous folks. And we certainly hope that this conversation can continue.
That was so nice. Thank you, Ingrid. I feel a lot of what you said, and I feel like even within this panel presentation, there's like different it's like multidisciplinary, but there's different aspects of coming at the same issues. And I feel like the more chances we have like this to connect with each other, I feel like the stronger we'll be. I mean, like you're down there doing policy, which is like a huge component of like tribal sovereignty and protecting Native people and like having the ability to do that and making sure that the policies we have are not harmful. And then, you know, there's Jolene putting the pieces together with sexual violence. And I just feel really lucky and blessed. And I just appreciate the invite. And hopefully we can just continue these conversations and continue to find ways to work with one another. We have this saying, it's not a saying, it's a meme. Well, actually I have two memes that come to mind. One was when you heal yourself, you're healing your ancestors. And like, to me, that feels really good because I know that my mother's mother, actually my father's mother, my grandparents, my great-grandparents have gone through a lot, and a lot that I'll never know. And it brings me to this work. Like my great-grandmother was, she died during childbirth at IHS in Red Lake, where I'm assuming there wasn't just a lot of control over what was happening in the situation. And so like, I think when you're healing yourself, you heal the past, you know, your past ancestors. And then also like you're in a place where you can heal the generations to come. And then the other meme I thought of was pertaining to sexual health education, but it was like acquiring sex ed facts is the easy part. Working through the trauma to connect with ourselves and others is where the rubber meets the road. And so even just naming that, that it is difficult sometimes to be in this space, but you're not alone. And that there's other people who are working through the stuff too.
Yes, thank you both so much for all of this. My mind is kind of racing and thinking about how are we best able to really kind of collectively work on this and create more spaces to have these sorts of conversations and to really kind of build community within this. Just as a little throughout there, so the National Tribal Sexuality Resource Centers are the newest of MIWSAC's projects. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more from you all. And if there are things that you ever just want to talk about, if you need to bring somebody in for a training or to just listen to hear what's happening within your community, or if you want to be a part of the development of resources or sharing voice or things like that, please reach out. We really just want to keep growing in this movement building as well. And so I just want to just say thank you all for kind of being here, hearing this, and I don't know, my brain is it's happy and it's just moving forward with this idea of there's so much potential. There's so much pain that has happened within so many of our communities, within our lives, within our families, but at the same point, there can be a lot of change and we can do a lot of really good things. And we have to. It's a call to action when it comes down to it, is that it's not optional to change. We have to really be putting forth this very hard and very important work. And so, Miigwech, thank you all for being here. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and that we get to continue this as that first step. And so thank you, Anna. Thank you, Ingrid. Huge thank you to our ASL interpreters, Amber and Hercules, who we adore. And I'm going to stop the recording now.